Alright, guys, so really open up your eyes for this one because this is going to be wow. So, the US is either very confident of winning the trade war or they are living in a fantasy. And this video, we really have to decipher what's going on here. Now, as we know, the US is on a global shakedown tour for money. Nearly $1 trillion from Korea and Japan. For Europe, the pledge was an insane 600 billion. However, all these deals can't be confirmed. Europe can't confirm the money while Korea refuses to give that amount in cash. And apparently, China is somehow eager to invest in the US. We have reports that China is asking Trump to drop national security restrictions on Chinese deals in the US. And to sweeten the deal, Beijing is willing to invest a figure of $1 trillion. Apparently, President Xi even asked Trump to create good conditions for Chinese firms to invest in America. Now, I don't know about you, but this sounds very implausible and just downright suspicious. If US allies themselves aren't eager to bankroll the US, it's highly unlikely that China will give $1 trillion of capital to Trump's economy. Even if the tariffs come down, some things just won't change. The US will still ring fence industries, including the auto sector and solar PVs. Do you think Trump will allow companies like Ford and GM to compete with affordable BYD imports? Really think about this. Secondly, what are the odds of the US removing the global sanction on semiconductors and chip makers on China? This is an existential struggle. So the answer is slim to none, and Slim is on vacation. And since the first trade war in 2018, Chinese investments into the US has been collapsing. Completed transactions went from nearly $60 billion a year down to $2 billion so far in 2025. That is an incredible crash because of the risk of investing in the US. Tariff policy is so unstable, and after what happened to Russia, are Chinese industrial assets in the US 100% completely safe? After TikTok, could there be more forced takeovers? Now, back in April, the central government already restricted Chinese companies from making investments in the United States. Just think back to the Panama Canal sale as well. Also, think back to the pushback against Chinese ownership of US land. Now, China faces very unique risks compared to US allies investing in the economy. A Japanese company investing $1 billion in the US, well, they face two big risks. The first is US consumers going broke because prices might just be too high. And secondly, US production is so expensive that they can't export it out. But China faces another problem, and that is potential confiscation. And this is where we need to talk about the potential threats of it. Now, take the ruling made in March in Missouri. There was a dangerous threat of Chinese owned farmland seizure. Now, the state won a 24 billion judgment against China for the pandemic. Is this really an outlier case, or could there be more shocks coming down the line? And that's why it's really bizarre how the US came to this idea that China will pile $1 trillion into the US. Now, could it happen? Sure, it could. But there will definitely be a mountain of caveats because the risks are just too high. Now, the TikTok deal is a prime example of how Chinese innovation or technology can be acquired by the Americans. Now, there's a lot of hoo ha and details surrounding this, and yes, the algorithm is still Chinese, but the US entity, the money making model, is now in the hands of American and international investors, which should really send red flags up to the sky. Now, ByteDance and Chinese investors will hold less than 20% of ownership stakes. 6 out of 7 seats on the board will be filed by NSA advisors and cybersecurity experts. So one can imagine the level of oversight possible if China moves more technology companies or even automakers to the US. Will Chinese tech be forcefully acquired, or will the Trump administration pull a new stunt on China? Now, we just don't know. That's why personally I can't take this $1 trillion pledge seriously. Even US allies aren't playing ball. Japan and Korea, they don't want to give the Trump administration cash. They're only willing to provide loans that has to be paid back. Now for China, even giving loans is a big problem. Imagine Trump getting $1 trillion worth of Chinese money. Now where do you think the money will flow to? the first place it will head to is chips and AI. Now, in 2024, the majority of data centers around the world are still American. The US has over 5,300 data centers, while China has less than 500. It's a very big lead and a reason why capital is still flowing to US technology markets. And if China invests $1 trillion or writes Trump a blank check, it will backfire on them. The US will channel that money to beef up their AI advantage, and it would be that much harder for Beijing to compete. Right now, China has the advantage financially in this chip war. They have cheaper power, they have more affordable labor, and their cost of borrowing is way lower than the United States. Why invest a trillion into US market? It just doesn't make sense. And let's look at this holistically. When it comes to global chip investments, China has the biggest war chest in the entire world. Shouldn't be a surprise when you have $1 trillion trade surplus. Now, China has allocated $142 billion for their semiconductor industry. It is not just money going to chip makers like SMIC and Huawei. It's money to build up the entire ecosystem, including surrounding industries. It's more than all the funding of the US, EU, and Taiwan combined. And that's how insane the amount is. Giving the US money is highly implausible. And I'm really wondering who came up with this idea. Was it Besson? Was it Greer? And until we see the Chinese readout and the official statements from Beijing, I can't really take this that seriously. Could be another red herring from Washington to pop up US markets. Now, Besson has made it crystal clear that money invested in the US would be directed at Trump's discretion, meaning you can't really cherry pick what to invest in, even though it's your own money. Everything will be filtered through Trump or the White House.
Have these agreements in place where the Japanese, the Koreans, and to some extent the Europeans will invest in companies and industries that we direct them largely at the president's discretion.
Now, besides that, the US Committee on Foreign Investments has made multiple attempts to scuttle China's investment efforts. It's a financial minefield that could get worse down the road. They stopped an attempt by a Jack Ma firm to buy MoneyGram, a payments giant. They also kicked a Chinese crypto mining company off land near a US military base. And of course, the justification was on the basis of national security. So we shouldn't take in wholesale what Washington is telling us. Guys, it's a great story. It's a fantastic lure to drive stock prices even higher. But on the economic and a geostrategic level, it just doesn't hold water. Most likely, China is going to double down on investing in their own industries because they hold a very commanding position when it comes to the future of technology. Now, ask yourself this question: what drives tech? All those data centers, they need something to run, right? They don't run on fairy dust, and that is power. China has fossil fuels, solar farms, nuclear plants, wind, and hydro, and this gives them a very big edge against the US. AI data centers will consume 4.4% of global power demand in the world by 2035, and this is a very big limiting factor. A lot of investment is needed to scale up power infrastructure. And do you think China will really provide the US with this extra capital to overtake Beijing? In major US markets, data center power demand will exceed all other types of new technology. And this is the pivotal line. AI growth will soon be limited by energy. It probably won't be chips because of Moore's law. There's a limit to how small and effective they can get. And it's all about incentives here. If China allocates $1 trillion to the US, they will be denying their own industries and companies of capital. The cost of production and output per dollar in the US will be far lower as well, especially with the tariffs. But let's talk about the new investment fund that BRICS is setting up. And it's something that we have talked endlessly about. The breakaway from G7 financing is happening right now. Brazil and China, they are teaming up to create a new investment fund. This is so critical on so many fronts. It tells us that China is not stopping their efforts to globalize the world and develop their supply chains. Brazil's Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China will create a $1 billion fund. The money will go towards sectors like mining, agriculture, infrastructure, and AI. And this part is crucial. The fund will invest in debt securities and equity stakes in Brazil. In other words, China will be vendor financing Brazil. And where do you think the hardware and inputs will come from? It's probably going to come from Chinese providers in Shenzhen, in Shanghai. And this is how China is using their trade surplus to help BRICS partners and secure demand for their own industries. It's the direct opposite to Trump's strategy of tariffs and isolation. Now, the US is stuck in their fortress of solitude, while China is going around the world making friends and economic allies. Very different approaches. Now, Brazil, like many victims of US tariffs, are very eager to find new markets to partner and sell to, and the biggest of which is China, a growing middle class and consumers beginning to buy more and more. In August, the US imposed a massive 50% tariff on Brazil, and because of that, Brazilian coffee exports to the US are starting to crash. Exporters are scrambling to reroute supplies to places like Mexico and Colombia. But those markets are still limited by spending power and population. China understands this and they are using economic diplomacy very effectively in this trade war. If your adversary closes off their markets to trading partners, the counter move is very obvious. You start opening yours to welcome them and aggressively build trade with them. Now, moments after the tariffs, China approved over 180 Brazilian coffee sellers to sell in their markets. And this is a big deal because China is home to Luckin Coffee and they are pushing out Starbucks in a very aggressive way, which means China can put Brazilian beans front and center to their customers. There are no barriers, and this one market can help Brazil rebound from their US slump. And let's put this into perspective. Where China cranks their demand gear up, they can go from nothing to everything in a hurry, and BRICS partners, they know this. Before 2020, Chinese demand for Brazilian beans was non existent, less than 130,000 bags a year, but in 2023, this flew up to 1.3 million bags out of nowhere. And now that Trump has slapped Brazil with a 50% tariff, exports to China has nowhere else but to go up. Imagine the implications. Not only is Brazil supplying China with soybeans and replacing American farmers, now China is blunting US tariffs on Brazilian coffee. It's one big mess after another for Washington. We can expect even more investment funds popping up from BRICS to counter the G7. And doing so, this makes the bloc even more consequential. And sooner or later, we will reach the tipping point. And that's when BRICS becomes not just a big supplier of commodities, energy, or chips, but when BRICS becomes the biggest consumer in the world as well. Then it's truly game over for US hegemony. But let me know what you think. Will China really invest $1 trillion in the US? And will BRICS continue to set up more investment funds? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe. Be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.